My Family History by Margaret Demoline. Grandmother Abbess. Grandmother Abbess was born in 1862, 1 year after Granddad Abbess was born. Her name was Harriet Ann Kelo, but everyone called her Haiti. The Kelos are a large Scotch-Irish family with many branches scattered throughout North America, and a great deal of research has been done on the family. In the early history of Scotland, there was a family named MacKillop that had lived in that land for 1,000 years. In about 1600, the Mac was dropped and Kellogg became Kilo when the family began moving to Ireland for better opportunities. The story of the Kilos was intertwined with the noted MacDonald clan to whom they were related. They were one of several families called septs, which were united with the MacDonalds for common defense, as well as being related by blood. They were staunch Presbyterians from the time John Knox started the Protestant church in Scotland, and when some of the family moved to Ireland, they would cross the sea back to Scotland to have their babies baptized in the Presbyterian church. The forefather of the Kilo family in North America was John Kilo, who was born in Scotland about 1630 and lived among the lakes and mountains of the West Highlands. He was recruited as a soldier in Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army and sent to Ireland in 1649 to help bring the Irish guerrilla wars to an end. The family called him John Drogheda because that was the city where his garrison was located. The army marched from city to city in Ireland, keeping peace and order over the rebellious Irish. A present-day relative and army officer, Stephen Kilo, has written the following about Cromwell's army, giving a picture of the kind of people our ancestors were. The New Model Army was one of the finest military units ever to engage in combat. Its members were noted for high personal moral standards and for outstanding discipline. Oliver Cromwell used Scots in his army because he felt they made ideal soldiers. They were products of a hard environment and quite early in life learned to take the worst life can send, to fight back, to give blow for blow, and when they had done their best, to endure. Observers said that they were devout, logical, kindly, and hospitable. They loved freedom and believed the Bible literally. It was this breed that would carry civilization to the frontier in America. 10 years after going to Ireland, John Kilo was listed in local records as a gentleman, meaning in that age that he was a man of some breeding and learning in a class of society just below nobility. John accepted a tract of land from the Irish government in Antrim County, in the province of Ulster as a reward for his services and spent the rest of his life there. He married Mary Hyde, and they had a son named John, who in turn had sons named John and Robert. In the early 1700s, when religious persecution and economic conditions were making life difficult, these two grandsons of John Drogheda and their families immigrated to America in search of a new and better life. All of the people they sailed with from Ireland were Presbyterian. As a group, they were described as energetic and intelligent, with strong moral and religious convictions. Records indicate that by the standard of the other families, the Killows were literate and well-to-do. John and Robert Killow first came to Worcester, Massachusetts, but then settled in Cumberland County and later Franklin County, Pennsylvania, where Presbyterians were more welcome. Both brothers had large families, and the Killows multiplied rapidly, but remained close. They bought land next to each other, and when they moved, they went as a unit. When the family became too big for this, branches were formed and divisions of the branches that usually stayed together. That first John Killow in America had married Jean Young, and their son Samuel Ezekiel would become the patriarch of the Old South branch of Killows. This is the branch we descended from, and Samuel Ezekiel was my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. The family tree is confusing because every generation seems to have sons named John, Samuel, and Isaac, and many of the middle names are not known. Also, a number of the men married women named Mary. Sam Ezekiel and his wife, Mary, had a son named Isaac, who would become the ancestor of the Rutherford division of the Old South branch that was named after the county in Tennessee where his sons would eventually settle following the Revolutionary War. Our own family is a part of the Rutherford division of Killows, and this Isaac was my great-great-great-great-grandfather. In the 1760s, Isaac and his wife, also a Mary, moved with their Killow families from Pennsylvania to the Carolinas, where more land was available. Isaac was a farmer all of his life and liked to sign himself the planter. He lived on the south side of the Catawba River in Mecklen County, North Carolina, and then on his Turkey Creek farm in Chester County, South Carolina. Like most of the men in the family, Isaac was active in politics and the church. If there was not a Presbyterian church where they moved, they always built one. Isaac and Mary had 6 children, and their son Samuel, born in 1763, became my great-great-great-grandfather. Sam Killow began fighting in the Revolutionary War as a teenager, like most of his brothers and cousins. They all likely fought in the Battle of Kings Mountain, which was described in a letter from that time as follows. The British Major Ferguson, dispatched by General Cornwallis into the western region of North Carolina to subdue the back counties, sent word to the settlers that if they did not desist from their opposition to the British arms, he would cross the mountain, hang their leaders, and lay waste to the country with fire and sword. In characteristic fashion, the frontiersmen determined to attack Ferguson at once, before he could move on them. They gathered over 1,200 men, and a draft was taken to provide a guard for the home settlements. After a powerful sermon by the noted Presbyterian Dr. Samuel Doak, in which he exhorted them to go forth with the sword of the Lord and Gideon, they set out to cross the mountains. All were armed with the usual rifle, tomahawk, and hunting knife, and wore sprigs of evergreen in their coonskin caps. Nearly all were mounted on their own horses. Ferguson entrenched himself just over the border in South Carolina on Kings Mountain, from which he stoutly asserted that neither God Almighty nor all the rebels outside of hell could dislodge him. The frontiersmen, after 30 hours in the saddle, drenched by rain and with inferior numbers, proceeded to storm the stronghold. They fought with a combination of tactical skills and Indian cunning, taking advantage of every bit of cover. The battle lasted some hours, during which it was said the whole mountain was covered in smoke and seemed to thunder. But at last Ferguson was killed, and his men, who were left alive, surrendered. This battle played a decisive role in eventually defeating Cornwallis and winning the Revolutionary War. It is especially interesting to me that Lusk relatives on my mother's side of the family fought in the Battle of Kings Mountain along with the Killows. Later, the army sent Sam to Georgia, where he stayed after the war as an Indian spy, becoming captain of the Jackson County Militia. He lived in the wilderness, ranging over wide areas, searching for Indians and coming into the fort about every 10 days. He thrived on the adventurous life for a number of years before settling down and marrying Mary McCartney, who was said to be well educated for her day. Sam's parents, Isaac and Mary, had also moved from the Carolinas to Georgia after the war, owning property in various parts of Wilkes County and living out their lives there. Sam and his Mary wanted to move west, though, to find more fertile land. In 1806, they took their family, along with some of his brothers and their families, and found an ideal place that was said to be abounding in bluegrass and cedar, with dark loam soil, which was very good farmland. It was near the Stone River in Murfreesboro in Rutherford County, Tennessee, thus the name Rutherford Division for our part of the family. Sam Killo bought 640 acres in Rutherford County for $700 and established a prosperous plantation. County records have many entries of him buying, selling, and trading property, but the original plantation remained the home where he and Mary raised their 11 children and spent the rest of their lives. He had a double log house built on a small rise of land with each room about 18 by 20 feet, a large breezeway in between, a rock chimney on each end, and a shed room on one side. Each room had an upstairs for sleeping. A log kitchen about 16 feet square was set 30 feet away from the house, as was the custom since it was a fire hazard. A separate log house nearby was the guest house. 5 acres with large oak trees was fenced off for the front yard, and it was described as a beautiful place. Back of Sam and Mary's home were the slave quarters, consisting of long log buildings, well built with several rooms in each building, which were considered much better than the usual slave quarters. Every slave family evidently had 2 rooms, and there was a rock fireplace for each 2 rooms. Census records show that Sam had at least 18 slaves on his plantation in 1820, though that number grew as he prospered. Presbyterians lived by strict moral principles, but they usually accepted slavery as a universal condition. Most Kilos held this view, although a few belonged to a more conservative arm of the church opposed to slavery. Sam was very strict about always treating his slaves with kindness and never separating children from their mothers. A cousin who visited the home often told about the house Negroes, whom Sam insisted were always to be available to Mary. They included yard men, a cook, and 2 mammies, among others. The mammies spent their time caring for the children and playing with them, telling them stories for as long as they would listen, and even carrying the children on their backs when asked. Meanwhile, Mary took care of the children's education, teaching them at home since the schools were only open for short terms each year. She was determined that her children would be well educated, as she had been. In managing the household, she depended most on Bedford, the head yard man. His word was law to the other slaves, and it was said he could get anything done that was needed. He met all visitors at the front gate, taking charge of their horses, and when anyone needed a horse, he would saddle it and lead it to the gate. The Kilo children said they loved the slaves like members of the family, sometimes even saying they loved Bedford more than the family. In his will, Sam left all of the house Negroes to his wife and named which children were to inherit each of the other slaves, specifying that no mother was to be separated from her children until they were grown. Sam and Mary's son, Isaac B. Kilo, was my great-great-grandfather. As a young man, Isaac had a drinking problem that concerned his father greatly. So Sam put Isaac's share of the family fortune in a trust to be handled by his brothers. A cousin wrote, "The fact of his being cut off brought him to his senses, and he quit drinking. In a few years, his brothers let him begin to handle his financial affairs, and it wasn't long before he handled everything." One of his brothers described Isaac as a well-read, very intelligent, well-known, and well-liked. He became the first county recorder in Murfreesboro. He did very well in his marriage, also marrying Mary Doak McKean. This Mary was an exceptional addition to the family, who provided us with some fascinating ancestors. Great-great-grandmother Mary's father, Captain Alexander McKean, was an officer in the Revolutionary Army. After the war, he became the trustee of public buildings in Guilford County, North Carolina, where he owned a 400-acre farm. His mother, Mary's grandmother, was Sarah Hamilton, who had come directly from Scotland. An old family letter states that the Hamilton family was next to the throne in Scotland. They are referred to in historical writings as a very wealthy and aristocratic family, many of whom were members of the nobility. Sarah's most interesting cousin, and one of our most admired distant cousins, was Alexander Hamilton, the American statesman. His grandfather, who had the same name, was Alexander Hamilton of Grange, Lancashire, Scotland, and was married to Elizabeth, daughter of Sir R. Pollock, Laird of Cambuskeith. Their son, James H. Hamilton, left home in 1737 at 19 years of age and sailed to the Leeward Islands in the West Indies to seek his fortune. He became a merchant on the island of St. Christopher, St. Kitts, and lived with the daughter of a French Huguenot physician and planter, Rachel Fawcett, who was separated from her husband. For some reason, they could not get married, but they had a son whom they named Alexander Hamilton, born in Charlestown on the nearby island of Nevis about 1755. After a turbulent childhood during which he was largely self-educated, this Alexander became a lieutenant colonel on George Washington's staff in the Revolutionary War, serving as Washington's private secretary and confidential aide. When Washington was chosen the first president of the United States, Alexander was appointed Secretary of the Treasury in the President's cabinet and was known as the father of banking. He also produced a number of important writings on strengthening the Union, which were described as brilliant, including his writing of over half the Federalist Papers. At the same time, Alexander remained the continual chief advisor of Washington throughout his presidency. The Encyclopedia Britannica has an article on Alexander Hamilton that states, "To no other man except to Washington and Marshall does American nationalism owe so much? The French statesman Charles Talleyrand, who lived during the same period as Alexander, wrote these words: "I consider Napoleon, Fox, the British statesman, and Hamilton the three great men of our epoch, and if I was forced to decide between the three, I would give without hesitation the first place to Hamilton." Then, in 1804, Alexander was challenged to a duel by his political enemy, Aaron Burr, after trying to end Burr's political career, and Burr killed him. He was only 50 years of age. I remember my father showing me a paper signed by Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, when I was a child, and telling me proudly that we were related to this illustrious man whose life was cut so short. Another distinguished family of our relatives is the Paisley family that originated in Scotland and moved to Ireland before coming to America in the early 1700s, like the Killows. Mary Ann Paisley married James Doak, whose family had also gone from Scotland to Ireland, and his grandfather had come to America from Antrim County in Ulster about the same time as the first Killow brothers had had sons and grandsons in the Revolutionary War. It was the daughter of this James and Mary Ann Doak, also named Mary, who married Captain McKean and became the mother of great-great-grandmother Mary. Among their notable Doak cousins and our distant notable cousins was Samuel Doak, who gave the sermon to the troops before the Battle of Kings Mountain and was considered the leading Presbyterian minister in Tennessee. Dr. Doak had graduated from the College of New Jersey that later became Princeton University and was ordained in the Presbyterian Church after being tutored in theology. He became the first moderator of the First Presbytery in Tennessee and built several churches there. He also built the first classical school west of the Appalachian Mountains, and it became Washington College. It is said that he brought the library for the college to Tennessee in his saddlebags. He later opened a second school that would become Tusculum College in Greeneville, Tennessee. Another Doak cousin of great-great-grandmother Mary had the wonderful name of Thankful Doak, and she had married John Finley, who traced his ancestry back to Macbeth. This Macbeth, whose story was told so dramatically by Shakespeare, was the son of Momar Finlay, or Finlay, ruler of the Manor of Moray, so Macbeth's surname was Finley. In the year 1040, Macbeth became the king of Scotland by killing King Duncan and reigned until 1058, when he was killed in battle. His descendants, the Finleys, eventually moved to Ireland like the Killows, and then came to America about the same time. They too were Presbyterians. James Finley and his wife, Elizabeth Patterson, settled in Pennsylvania in 1720. It was their son, John Finley, who married Thankful Doak. Then their great-great-granddaughter, Mary Finley, Polly, married Davy Crockett in 1806 and was the mother of his first 3 children. David, who did not like to be called Davy, was a poor farmer when they married, but Polly saw that he had potential. He had only 4 days of schooling as a child, but arranged to attend a school conducted by his employer's son for 6 months as a young adult. He also became an expert marksman by borrowing his employer's rifle to practice and began entering shooting contests. Contestants would pay 25 cents for a shot, and the best shot often won a quarter of beef. David became so good that he won all 4 quarters of beef in several contests and was able to buy his own rifle. In 1813, he became commander of a battalion in the Creek Indian War. Polly died in 1815 before seeing him elected to Congress, become a national celebrity, and finally die as a hero defending the Alamo in Texas. After Polly's death, he was so desperate for help with his young children that David soon married a widow, Elizabeth Patton, with children of her own, and they would later have children together. Interestingly, this second wife was related to us through my mother's family, making us related to both of David Crockett's wives and all of his children. Our first relatives in Texas were most likely the John Parkers. In the early 1700s, the first John Parker in America had bought land next to the first John Kilo in Pennsylvania, and a nephew of that John Kilo had married Margaret Parker. Through the years, other Parker girls married into the Kilo family, and some Kilo girls married into the Parker family, but we do not know exactly how the Texas Parkers were related to us. Researchers have written that records do not exist to prove that relationship, but have concluded that the John Parkers who came to Texas about 1834 were distant cousins of our Kilo family. I remember Grandmother Abbess referring to their tragic story with sadness and saying they were relatives of ours. John Parker came with 8 families of close relatives and settled on the headwaters of the Navasota River in what is now Limestone County in northeast Texas. They built a private fort to protect their families and planted crops outside the walls. 2 years later, the year Texas gained its independence from Mexico, several hundred Comanche, Caddo, and Kiowa Indians raided the Parkers' fort. 5 settlers were killed and 5 captured, including 9-year-old Cynthia Parker, the daughter of Silas M. and Lucy Parker. A Comanche family adopted Cynthia Ann, and she grew up among the Indians, forgetting white ways and becoming thoroughly Comanche. When she was a teenager, she married Peta Nocona, a young chief known for his many violent raids on white settlements. While Comanche warriors normally took several wives, Petta never took any wife except Cynthia Ann. This was said to be a mark of extraordinary devotion and honor for her. They had 2 sons, Kawana and Pecos, and a daughter, Topsana. There is a story that Cynthia Ann's brother, who had been captured with her, tried to get her to return to their white family, but that she said she loved her husband and children too much to leave them. Through the years, Indian traders, federal officials, and Texas Rangers encounter her on several occasions, but the Indians would not release her. In 1860, the Rangers finally captured her and her baby girl, along with other Indians, and returned her to Fort Parker. When they went through Fort Worth, Cynthia Ann's picture was taken with her baby at her breast and her hair cut short, a Comanche sign of mourning. She thought Petta had been killed and feared she would never see her sons again, although her husband had only been wounded and had escaped with their sons. She never did adjust to living in white society, though, and tried to flee to her Comanche family several times. As one account said, her grief and longing for her lost family never left her. After hearing that Pecos had died of smallpox, and then her daughter died of influenza, Cynthia declined further, often refusing to speak or eat. At age 43, she also died of influenza. Cynthia Ann's son, Kawana, who was known as Kawana Parker, became a fierce warrior and then one of the greatest Indian chiefs ever. When the Comanches finally surrendered, Kawana helped bring them to the reservation in Oklahoma and led them to adopting to life with the white man, in establishing schools and learning ranching. He went to Washington a number of times to work for Indian rights and became an official over several reservations in Oklahoma. One publication described him as a popular leader whose honesty and fairness were known to all. Eventually, some of his Parker relatives got in touch with him and formed a good family relationship, allowing him to move his mother's body and that of his little sister to Oklahoma. The West Texas town of Kawana was named in his honor, and noted ranchers in that area invited him to be their special guest at the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo several times. President Theodore Roosevelt even came to Texas to hunt with Kawana Parker. After Kawana's death, Cynthia Ann and her little girl were reinterred next to him on the Indian reservation at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The Handbook of Texas summarizes their lives as follows. Cynthia Ann Parker was a true pioneer of the American West, whose legacy was carried on by her son Kawana, serving as a link between whites and Comanches. Kawana Parker became the most influential Comanche leader of the reservation era. Another story I heard from grandmother was about the Kilo massacre in East Texas. The first Kilos came to Texas in 1837, as far as I know, and were among the first white families to settle in deep East Texas. The leader of this group was one of Sam Killo's brothers, so he was my great uncle. His name was Isaac, and since he had a twin brother, he was referred to as Isaac the Twin to distinguish him from his father, Isaac the Planter. The family group came from Alabama with 4 sons and 2 daughters, along with their families and in-laws, buying land and settling near the present town of Jacksonville. They made friends with the Indians, built houses, and planted crops. Then the next year, trouble started when a band of renegade Mexicans stirred up the Indians to begin terrorizing the settlers. This was most likely part of an effort by Mexicans to retake Texas. In October 1838, the Killos were attacked, and 18 family members were killed, including Uncle Isaac. The Killo Massacre was the largest Indian atrocity in the history of East Texas. Only Isaac's wife, 2 daughters-in-law, and a baby boy named Billy escaped from the settlement. They hid in the grass by day and moved at night. Indians came close several times, and the women feared the baby would cry or the little dog that followed them would bark. Finally, they were found by friendly Indians who gave them food and horses, and they made their way to safety at Fort Lacey, 40 miles away. After the massacre, Killo family members who had been away from the settlement during the attack returned to their land, along with the brave women who had escaped and remained there. 10 years later, as members of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, they helped start Larissa College. This was the denomination's first college in Texas and was dedicated to the classics. Killos helped to finance the college and serve on the board. Many family members also attended the school. Someone said that a characteristic of the Killo family continued to be that they were better educated than the average person. During the Civil War, Larissa College had to be closed, but it reopened in 1869 as one of the 3 colleges uniting to form Trinity University in the small town of Texarkana in Limestone County. A historian wrote, "University founders believed that students needed to be sequestered from society's evils and found their dream in a town an hour's buggy ride from the nearest rail station. On opening day, they had 7 students, but from the very beginning, there was a commitment to quality, not a commitment that bigger is better." This is the university later moved to Waxahachie and then to San Antonio, which I graduated from in 1944, and where I met my husband-to-be, who finished that summer before I did. I had no idea then that my relatives had helped to start the school about 100 years earlier. Today, it has been named the top university among master's level institutions in the western region of the United States. It was around the same time as the Killo Massacre that one of Sam Killo's sons ventured from Tennessee to Texas. He was Samuel Blackburn Killo, and he settled in East Texas as well, but further west in the community of Wheelock in Robertson County. In about 1840, he married Annette Wheelock, for whose family the community was named, and who had 2 short marriages beforehand. Her first husband had been captured and killed by the Indians. She had been kidnapped at the same time, but rescued by her father, who was a captain in the Texas Rangers. Then her second husband was killed in the Texas War for Independence. She and Samuel B. had a long and successful marriage, though with 10 children. The state of Texas gave her a league of land, 2,200 acres, for each husband she had lost, and Samuel did well on his own also. Together they eventually owned 1,200 acres on which they raised cattle and sheep, and they were quite prosperous. He became a county commissioner, county judge, and a member of the Third Constitutional Convention of Texas, and a captain in the Confederate Army. In 1846, a short but memorable trip to Texas had been made by William Allen Killow, the youngest son of Sam and Mary. William had wanted to join the U.S. Army to fight in the war with Mexico when a company was formed in Rutherford County, but illness delayed him until it was too late to join up. Being quite adventurous, he went on to Texas anyhow, in spite of ill health, traveling with a friend referred to as an old Westerner. His friend suggested that they take goods to trade on the way. So they took some bolts of calico and cloth from which to make men's pants and coats, as well as several dozen pairs of socks and rolls of pins, needles, and hairpins. In northeast Texas, William traded a man 16 pairs of socks for the deed to 160 acres of land, which was supposed to be only a few miles west of there. Later he found that the land was 100 miles west and in Indian country, so they did not even go there. They did get to do what William most wanted to do, though, and that was to hunt buffalo. When they reached the prairie in East Texas, he would later brag that they were able to kill buffalo every day. This gave them plenty of meat to eat, and the older man advised William to roast the large bones and cook the marrow to eat as a cure for all his ailments. It evidently worked, too. By the time the trip was over, 3 months later, he had gained 20 pounds and regained his health. William wanted to stay in Texas, but his father had died, and as the youngest son, it was his responsibility to remain at home and take care of his mother. Great-great-great-grandfather Sam had died in 1842 at the age of 78. Mary lived into her 70s as well, staying on in the homestead until her death in 1850. Then, in accord with Sam's will, all of his property was sold at public auction so his assets could be divided evenly among his 7 children. Everything was sold except the slaves. While the slaves' children stayed with their mothers, the grown slaves were given a choice of which family of Mary's children they wanted to go with, making 3 choices so that each of the families would be given about the same value. All of this took time, but after the estate was finally settled, Most of these families began preparing to move to Texas to take advantage of the opportunities in the new state. My great-great-grandfather, the reformed Isaac B. Kilo, and his wife, with the fascinating relatives, Mary Doak McKean Kilo, were in their mid-50s when they made this move in 1857. Their 9 children had been born in Tennessee, the second of whom was Alexander McKean Kilo, Alex, my grandfather. Most of Isaac's children and their families joined the other Kilos in this move, which included William, who had married by then. They came in big ox-drawn wagons, pulled by 2 or 3 yokes of oxen each. A considerable number of good riding horses were brought, but the men walked most of the way. Rivers had to be forded unless there was a ferry, and they sometimes had to wait for high water to go down. They camped in bottomland near rivers, where the mosquitoes were so bad that they developed malaria and had chills and fever much of the time. The 700-mile trip took over 2 months, but it ended in north-central Texas, where they found fine cow and sheep country with plenty of good grass and water. Great-great-grandfather Isaac and his family became some of the first settlers in Buchanan, a small settlement in Johnson County, near where the town of Cleburne would be built. Census records show that Isaac bought 2,000 acres and leased more, so he was farming and ranching on 3,500 acres. An old book, The Lone Star, Johnson and Hill County's volume, says the following about Isaac Kilo. He was well educated and kept himself informed on all matters of general interest, and on all necessary occasions manifested a spirit of enterprise, benevolence, and Christian charity. His son Alex, who was 27 years old when the family came to Texas, bought land at Buchanan like his father and began farming with the help of his young slave named Jim. This Jim was undoubtedly descended from slaves belonging to Alex's grandfather, Sam Kilo. When Texas belonged to Mexico, slavery was not allowed, but this changed after Texas won its independence in 1836. The colonists coming into the state were mainly Southerners, and ownership of slaves was a cultural institution that they supported, even those who did not own any slaves themselves. In 1861, 3 years after settling in Texas, Alex married his neighbor's daughter, Harriet Elizabeth Hicks, Lizzie. The forefather of Lizzie's family was John Hicks, sometimes spelled Hicks, who lived in England. His son William and wife Jane came to America from England in 1693 and settled near Baltimore, Maryland. William died in Baltimore in 1710. His son, Nehemiah, married a woman with the interesting name of Philizana Hitchcock, daughter of William Hitchcock, and they had 12 children. Nehemiah's will, probated in 1769, names his property as Hicks Forest and Meadowland on the western fork of the Great Falls on the Gunpowder River in Baltimore County. One of Nehemiah and Philizana's sons was named Isaac, and Isaac Hicks married Elizabeth Miller, daughter of John Miller. All of the Hicks family in the Baltimore area until after the all of the Hicks family stayed in the Baltimore area until after the Revolutionary War. Then in 1782 they moved to Sullivan County, Tennessee, where Isaac and Elizabeth Hicks raised their 9 children and spent the rest of their lives. The wills of Isaac Hicks and his children showed that they owned considerable property and slaves. An excerpt from Isaac's will gives the following to his only daughter. In consideration to my natural affection, which I have for my daughter Jemina, I have given the plantation or tract of land containing 130 acres, and my Negro named Tobe, and my Negro girl called Ellie, for and during their natural lives, and the life of the survivors of them from this date. Isaac and Elizabeth Hicks had a son with the colorful name of Greenberry, and he became my great-great-great-grandfather. Greenberry married Mary Bond, Polly, the daughter of William Bond, and they moved to Tompkinsville, Kentucky. This was where they raised their 5 children and lived their remaining days. One of their sons, James G. Hicks, also married a Polly Howard, and the first of their 6 children was Lizzie, my great-grandmother. Her mother died when Lizzie was 13 years old, and she took over the role of mothering the young children. Then after 3 years, her father married Sophia Lee, and they would later move to Texas, buying 2,500 acres near Cleburne. There is a record of my brother of James G., named Greenberry B. Hicks, buying 1,600 acres north of Cleburne about the same time. This relative died before he could settle this property, but his wife and 7 children later came from Kentucky to settle on it. James G. Hicks had 9 children in his second marriage, with 2 dying in infancy, and he was 57 years old when the last child was born. Lizzie stayed at home to help care for her brothers and sisters until she was 27 years old and married Alex Killow. The year after Alex and Lizzie were married, their daughter Harriet Ann Killow, Hattie, my grandmother, was born in August 1862. Only a few months later, in January 1863, Alex was called up to join the Confederate Army, as were his brothers and Lizzie's brothers. Alex joined Company E of the 13th Texas Cavalry in Gurley's regiment with his youngest brother, James H. Killow, Jim. With most of the young men going off to war and Indians still a danger, the families around Buchanan moved closer together and tried to help each other. Lizzie and the baby stayed on the farm with her relatives and her husband's relatives nearby, and the slave Jim to care for them. The youngest Killow brother, William, was one of the men selected to stay in the north central area of Texas to protect families against Indians. This was similar to the work of the Texas Rangers, and William patrolled the area riding a mule because he said it was a stronger than any horse and could outrun Indian ponies. However, marauding Yankees did raid the farm where Lizzie and Hattie were staying and stole chickens and grain. Jim cleverly helped Lizzie and Hattie hide in the hayloft and hid the cows and horses in the brush so they were not found. The family considered the slave a hero and would always be grateful to him. Also, he delighted in sharing the details of the experience with Hattie's own son over and over again many years later. The 13th Texas Cavalry participated in more than 25 engagements, including the last major Civil War engagement in Indian Territory on September 19, 1864. This was the Battle of Cabin Creek near the present town of Veneta, Oklahoma. The Confederates intercepted a Union supply train with a convoy of 130 wagons carrying supplies worth $1.5 million, a huge amount in those days, and captured it even though the Yankees had a well-fortified position there. Alex's brother Jim was killed in the battle. We have a letter that Alex wrote to Lizzie on September 30th of that year describing what happened. After an absence of 2 weeks beyond the Ark River, we have returned to this place, again much worn out and exhausted. We were in 3 engagements with the enemy, which resulted in victory for our arms, but the victory on my part was overshadowed with gloom on account of the death of my dear brother, who was killed in the last engagement. He was brave, he was good, he was beloved by all the company, who deeply mourn his loss. He was shot while making the 3rd charge on the enemy works just before daylight. We were ordered to fire and lay down. He was reloading when the ball struck him, passing through his arm near the body and into his side under his arm. He lived but a few minutes and passed away. I have reason to believe to that bright army where there will be no more roll call or blast of the bugle to disturb his rest. It is impossible to describe to you how sad, how lonely, how desolate I felt on that occasion. Language cannot express my feelings. I know my mother and father will take his death very hard, but it is the will of God, and we should submit to his acts the best we can. We captured a very large train, burnt about half of it, and brought the balance through. It was thought we will start for the Red River soon, and if so, I hope I will get to come home this fall. Tell Hattie I have a new dress for her, also one for you and Mother. I must close right soon. Jim Kilo was buried on the east bank of Cabin Creek. A friend who helped bury him brought Jim's horse back to his parents' home. Records showed the horse was valued at $154, but it was priceless to the family. After the war, another brother, Allison Al, kept the horse until it died of old age, and no one was ever allowed to ride it again. We have letters to Alex from two of his sisters telling of their grief over Jim's death and concern for Alex. Mary, the sister who was just a year older than Jim, wrote these instructions. Take care of everything he had. All his letters we wrote to him, if he kept them, all of his clothing, if he left any, and everything he had, just like he left it. As to the new clothes, you can keep anything you need, but don't sell anything. I couldn't bear to think of anybody wearing his things. Oh, how sad and miserable I do feel. Lieutenant G.W. Chitwood, a friend and distant relative of the Kilo boys, was also killed at the Battle of Cabin Creek. There has been some confusion about Jim's death because there was another James H. Kilo, who was a nephew of Isaac. That James H. was wounded in a different battle and eventually died of his wounds after returning home and getting married. Samuel B. Kilo, Alex's older brother, was in Company C of the 12th Texas Cavalry and was mentioned in the Battle of Cotton Plant, but was not wounded or captured. Al and John Kilo, the younger brothers of Alex, who were both in the 10th Texas Infantry, were captured in Arkansas in 1863 and taken to Camp Douglas, Illinois. Camp records show that during that time the mortality rate among prisoners was the highest of any prison during the war, even worse than the widely publicized Andersonville, Georgia. Fortunately, Al and John were released several months later, but they were captured again the next year at the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, and taken to a prison in Nashville, from which they were later paroled. Lizzie's brother, James H. Hicks, wrote to her in early 1865, saying that he expected to get a furlough and asked her to tell the slaves to save that turkey, for I will be there by the last of February or the 1st of March if nothing happens. Another letter from James H. to his father seems to indicate that he and his brother, John Hicks, were still in the Army in August 1866. He says he has just sold the gun he captured for $300 in money. A faded copy of these letters has been kept with our other letters from the Civil War. We also have a letter from Lizzie to Alex that was written in March 1865. She told about her father planting 20 acres of corn that day, the grass coming slowly, a good many of the stock dying, and a cold norther blowing in that evening. She said she had heard that France, England, and Spain had acknowledged the Confederacy's independence, but that did not cheer her much because it would only enable us to carry on the war longer, and that was what she did not want to hear. She had hoped for peace that spring, but had now lost all hope. Her letter ends with this poem written for her husband. When the tide ceases to ebb and flow, when the needle forgets to point to the pole, when this heart palpates for the last time, then and only then shall I cease to think of you. Forget you, no, never. 2 months later, when news of the collapse of the Eastern Confederacy reached Texas, Alex's unit was sent to Austin and then disbanded in mid-May 1865. On June 19, 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation was received in Texas and read first in Galveston, although it had been issued in Washington 2 years earlier. The story goes that when the Kilo slaves were freed, they asked family members what last name they should use. The Kilo brothers conferred and thought up the name Mayfield. It seemed a nice sounding name, and they knew no one else by that name. The slaves liked it, and so they all took the name Mayfield. Jim Mayfield wanted to stay on to help Alex and Lizzie, and he did stay until Alex got settled on the farm again. Then Alex and Lizzie gave him land for a farm of his own in the area near Cleburne, where other slaves had settled. Several of the Kilo children kept in touch with their former slaves and visited them in their homes. Jim Mayfield would have a warm relationship with the family of his former owners for the rest of his life, and his children and grandchildren would carry on the relationship. After the war, Alex and Lizzie had a son, William, my great-uncle Will. Then right after that, they had another baby boy who died of colic at 6 months of age. We have a certificate showing Alex was elected county commissioner in 1866, and another certificate that commissioned him an elector of Johnson County. The tragedy of the Civil War continued for Alex and Lizzie, though. Like many veterans, his health was never good after the war. He suffered intermittently from black jaundice, the worst form of yellow fever, contracted from the contaminated water and unsanitary conditions of the army camps. 4 years after returning home, Alex died at age 39, leaving Lizzie alone with 2 young children. His father, Isaac, had died 2 years before, in 1867, at 65 years of age. After Alex's death, Lizzie stayed on the farm with her young children next to her father's home. Census records indicate that her husband left her 500 acres, and she was using 300 of these acres. All of the Hicks boys returned from the war safely, some staying on the home place and others moving away. We have a faded letter written after the war from John Hicks in Henderson County, asking his father how to make a snuff plaster to put on a child with croup. It appears that Lizzie continued living by her father until his death about 10 years after Alex died, and then moved with her children into the town of Cleburne. She never remarried, as young widows usually did in those days. Johnson County records show that J.W. man took out a license to marry Lizzie in 1877, but she could not go through with it. Lizzie belonged to the First Christian Church in Cleburne with the rest of the Hicks family. Her father was one of the first elders of the congregation, which was organized in 1867, with the church building completed about 10 years later. Shortly before her father's death, this was known as a Campbellite church, started by the son of a Presbyterian minister who wanted to change a few things in his father's church, and the churches were very similar. Lizzie remained as an active member of this church for the sake of her father, even though she married into the traditional Presbyterian family of Killows. She raised the children in her church, too, since their father died when they were so young. I know she did follow the Killow custom of giving their children a good education, though, which was not often done in Texas at that time, especially for girls. Hattie was sent to a women's college known as a seminary for young women, where she was given a classical education that would enrich her life for the rest of her days. Her brother, Will, went into the furniture business, and he and a partner opened a furniture store in Cleburne, which was very successful for many years. Alex's brothers and sisters and their family kept in close touch with Lizzie and her children, and never let them forget that they were Killows. The three remaining Killow brothers had survived the war in fairly good health, and then married and raised their families in north central Texas. The oldest, Samuel B. Killow, married Mary E. Blair and opened a store in Alvarado near Cleburne, where he also had a 300-acre farm. He followed the family tradition of being involved in local politics and was a justice of the peace. An old book on that time says Samuel taught the young idea for several years, but I have not found out what this was. He also joined the Methodist Episcopal Church with his wife, and they were both active in that church. Meanwhile, his brother John married Naomi Jane Dillard, and later brother Al married Evelyn Dillard, Eva, probably sisters. John and Al opened a general store, cotton gin, and grist mill in Aurora near Fort Worth. Later, they opened a large stable in the neighboring community of Newark to be operated by John's sons. An old book on Newark says the Killow stable had 8 buggies, single and double, and 1 family surrey for rent. Great-great-grandmother Mary moved to Aurora when her sons started their businesses there, and her home became a center for the family, as the home at Buchanan had been when Isaac was alive. Al lived with his mother until he married several years later, and her youngest daughter Sarah, who never married, continued living with Mary. When their daughters Nancy Nan and Elizabeth M. Mary lost their husbands, they moved in with their mother along with their children. Then when cousins came to work in the store, from time to time they too lived with Aunt Mary, as she was known to many. In this manner, great-great-grandmother Mary graciously carried on her role as matriarch of the Killot family for 25 years after her husband's death, until her passing at 87 years of age in 1892. Her longevity was remarkable for that day, especially after raising 9 children and helping to raise her grandchildren. Mary's oldest daughter, Harriet A. Killot, distinguished herself by marrying Colonel Barzillai J. Chambers, who was known as the father or founder of Cleburne. He had come from Kentucky originally and had served as a volunteer in the Texas War for Independence. Later, he went to Johnson County as a surveyor and became a large landowner there. He was married 3 times, the last to Harriet in 1861. Records show he enlisted in the Confederate Army with a $500 horse, a $500 gun, and a $25 of other equipment, all quite notable for that time, and served in the Home Guard. After the war in 1865, he helped to plan and survey the town of Cleburne and gave part of the land for it. The town was named after the Civil War hero General Patrick Cleburne, whom Colonel Chambers greatly admired. One of the main streets of the town was named Chambers Street. This new town was a center of support for the populist movement and the Greenback Party, and in 1876 Colonel Chambers was nominated for Vice President of the United States on the Greenback ticket, but was defeated. He continued to be known as one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Johnson County, and from all accounts, Harriet was an ideal wife for him. When she died at 82 years of age, her grave was marked by the largest monument in the Cleburne Cemetery. I always wanted to see her grave when I went to the cemetery as a child, and loved to stand there looking up at the beautiful angel on top. I was so proud that this was my great-great-aunt's monument, and felt it showed that our family was special. When Hattie married Ed Abbas in 1886, Ed built their home next to Lizzie's house in Cleburne. Then Hattie's brother, Will Killot, married Myra Job and built their house on the other side of Lizzie's. They were like one big family. Lizzie particularly enjoyed being close to her only grandchildren, Hattie and Ed's 2 daughters and their son. In 1914, Lizzie died of what was called paralysis, probably a stroke, at 80 years of age. An article about her death in the Cleburne newspaper states that despite the inclement weather, a large attendance came to pay their respects to the memory of their loved friend. After mentioning the many beautiful floral offerings, the article describes Lizzie as follows. This respected lady has lived all her life surrounded by growing plants and flowers on which she lavished tender care, being repaid 100-fold by their sweet blossoms. The friend who came to call and the little children who entered her yard were sent away with beautiful cut flowers when the season granted a rich blossom time. So we like to think of our departed friend going away with many flowers and living in the celestial gardens of the blessed Lord. A kind, sweet, gentle woman of Christian virtues, her reward is sure. Mrs. Kilo was a member of the First Christian Church, and her life was an exemplification of her faith. Hattie and Ed's first child was Corinne, a pretty girl who was seriously ill as a child and had health problems the rest of her life. She married Joe Wilson, who worked at the Santa Fe shops, and they had 2 daughters and 3 sons. Corinne worked hard taking care of her family, but it was very difficult for her, and grandmother did everything she could to help. The youngest child, Billy, was an especially sweet child with a speech impediment. Grandmother and her other daughter gave Billy a great deal of attention and helped raise him to be a fine man with a family of his own. Catherine, Kate, the second child in Ed and Hattie's family, went to business school and became a secretary. She never married, though, and lived with her parents all of her life. I was told as a child that she had been disappointed in love. She played the piano, was well read and well informed, capable and independent. If she had lived in a later time, I think she would have been an active feminist. In the early 1920s, she drove her car to California when it was necessary to cross the desert on boards. She visited a forest of giant redwoods, driving her car through the tunnel cut in one of the giant trees, and went on to Yosemite National Park. Then she drove up Pikes Peak, when that was quite daring. Aunt Myra, Uncle Will's wife, who was considerably younger than he, traveled with Aunt Kate. They took the train to the Grand Canyon, as well as to Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks, and toured the parks in large open-air buses. Their descriptions and pictures were breathtaking. Also, in 1928, when I was barely 4 years old, Aunt Kate drove my parents and me on a trip through the Ozark Mountains in her car. She had a large 4-door sedan, while my parents only had a coupe at that time. I can still remember staying in one of those few tourist courts on the way, and then in a tourist home on a steep bluff above a park in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. All of the other tourists there had come by bus, so we would take some of them with us every day on a drive into the mountains, visiting the highest peaks, waterfalls, Indian teepees, and shops with local handicrafts. I have loved traveling in the mountains ever since. My father, William Edward Abbas, Willie, and later Will or Bill, was born several years after his sisters in 1896. As the youngest child and the only boy, he was the pride and joy of his family, as well as of Uncle Will, who had no children. His father made little woodworking tools for him and taught him to use them at an early age, while Uncle Will evidently gave him plenty of attention as well. I have a copy of a note that my father wrote in the form of a letter to Uncle Will when he was about 7 or 8 years old. It says, "Could you find any wheels for Mr. Murphy today? To Mr. Kilo from Willie Abbas." I think he was asking for Uncle Will to get a bicycle for him. Also, there's a letter he wrote a year or 2 later to his grandmother Lizzie when he was in Mineral Wells with his mother. This was a pioneer spa where mineral water had been found to be effective in treating rheumatism and other ills. Boarding houses had sprung up, and there were Chautauqua programs, concerts, and other forms of family entertainment in the evenings. Hattie had gone there by train to take the waters, and Willie had gone with her. He wrote saying they were going to the picture show that night, asking how the cow was, and asking his grandmother to tell Uncle Will to paint his wheel so he could ride it when he got home. He said someone was sending a nice gift to his mama to give to her and asked her to write to him. Also, he said to tell his papa that they had moved to another place that was only $4 a week. Later, Willie got a dog that had become as important to him as his bicycle. Grandmother told about the dog being so devoted that it would not budge from under the bed when Willie was sick. Other choice memories were of visits from Jim Mayfield, the former slave, who would sit with the boy for hours, telling him about the war and the old days. Jim always came on Christmas morning to give them his holiday greetings and to receive the gift that was waiting for him. Hattie was an active member of the First Christian Church because of her mother, even though she married a Presbyterian like her mother had. She did send her children to the Anglin Street Presbyterian Church with their father, though, and visited that church with them. Will was involved in the church at an early age, as well as school activities and the YMCA, while also working in a drugstore during high school. He was business manager of the school yearbook and president of his senior class. A letter of reference written by the superintendent of schools in Cleburne, Emmett Brown, states the following: Mr. Abbas, throughout his high school career, was a militant factor for the good in the student body. He was president of his class at the time of graduation and had exemplified an unusual degree of ability to lead his fellows. His mental faculties were demonstrated to be far above the average of those possessed by the boys and girls who were his associates. After graduating, my father worked at the National Bank of Cleburne for a year to earn money for college, and then went to the University of Texas in Austin. He loved Austin and the university and would talk about it the rest of his life. Attending sporting events, running on the track team, playing tennis on the campus, and swimming at Barton Springs were some of his favorite activities outside of class. He was also pleased to be one of 4 pledges to the Delta Tau Delta fraternity, along with a friend from Cleburne. The friend's mother had asked my father to look after her son because he drank too much, and she knew my father did not drink and would not be influenced by others. He did have to take his friend home many a night, but he enjoyed the association with his fraternity brothers. At the same time, he felt privileged to live in a dormitory at the Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary and to know the seminary president, Dr. Thomas W. Curie. I think the dormitory has been used by the university while the seminary was temporarily closed during the war. Dr. Curie gave him a Bible at the end of the year, which he cherished the rest of his life. After his year at UT, my father enlisted in the Army when he was about to be drafted for World War I. He joined the Coast Artillery Corps, which trained men in the use of guns of 6 to 16 inches in caliber on wheels and railroad carriages to support our infantry in France. He was stationed at Fort Winfield Scott in San Francisco's Presidio, overlooking the Golden Gate, and he loved that area as he had loved Austin. He described the view in a letter to Aunt Myra as follows: Fort Scott is located on a hill. This affords us a splendid view of San Francisco. It is a beautiful sight to look down on the city at night with its many thousand lights twinkling like little stars. The moonlight on the bay is wonderful and far surpasses what any picture shows. He was disappointed, though, that he did not get to go overseas. The war ended just before he was scheduled to ship out. But then the flu epidemic of 1919 caused their whole base to be quarantined for 40 days, delaying his discharge. When the quarantine was lifted, he wrote that it had been about 40 days since he had seen a lady, except for the lady at the Y. How he enjoyed going into town for a good supper, and what a good feeling it was to be able to mingle in a crowd of civilians. When he did get home after the war, my father was offered a job as a bank examiner with the National Banking Department, so he did not return to college. After 2 years in that work, he was given a position with the Farmers and Merchants National Bank in Cleburne, and then got married when he was 25 years old. He married Ruby Margaret Lusk, Ruby, the daughter of his father's friend and fellow foreman at the Santa Fe shops, James William Lusk, Jim, and his wife Harriet Frances Davis, Frances. Ruby had been a year behind Bill in high school and had attended Teachers College in Denton to earn a teaching certificate. She was now 23 years old and was teaching the 2nd grade in an elementary school in Cleburne. They married in 1921 and set up housekeeping in an apartment while planning to build their own home. I will tell about my mother's family background and my parents' life together in another chapter. Hattie developed a close, loving relationship with her new daughter-in-law. They were both spiritual women with similar personalities whose lives were centered in their homes and families. Even though Hattie and Ed lived in town, they were able to keep a cow and chickens in the early days, so they had plenty of eggs, milk, butter for cooking, which grandmother loved to do. When I was a young child, I remember they still had chickens, and what fun it was to hunt for eggs when I came to see them. Then I remember sitting on a stool in their kitchen watching her rolling out dough for baking and eating supper at the table on the back porch with cowhide seats in the chairs, and gathering with all of the family around the big round table in the dining room when it was loaded with appetizing food in pretty dishes. I especially liked the cut glass bowl that grandmother filled with potato salad, and was thrilled when she gave me that bowl on my 16th birthday. I still prize it today. Then, as described in the chapter on Grandad Abbas, I gained more than I can say from Sunday afternoon visits with my grandparents, talking and listening in their bedroom sitting area, riding in the country around Cleburne, where their families first settled, and working on their families' plots at the cemetery. Grandmother kept well informed on the world and local affairs, and enjoyed discussing events and meanings along with her opinions and beliefs. At the same time, she always showed an exceptional interest in everything that was going on in my life and made me feel very special. She also loved music and listening to Kate play the piano, as well as quietly reading her cherished books. She had started collecting books in college, and while she liked to read current things, the classics remained her favorites next to the Bible. Grandmother's closest cousin and a family favorite was Cousin Belle. Colonel Chambers and his wife Harriet had 3 children, and Isabel Bell was the youngest. She inherited much of his wealth and property in the Cleburne area, but moved to Los Angeles after her husband, Ed Kelly, died early in the marriage. She had only one child, Dorothy. Cousin Belle was as flamboyant as grandmother was practical, and her life was as glamorous as grandmother's was serious. Yet their family ties were strong, and they kept in close touch by mail. Belle was gracious and generous with her wealth, too. When the Anglican Presbyterian Church needed an organ, grandmother asked her to contribute. She gave a magnificent pipe organ in memory of her mother. My sister Anne and I thought of her as a California fairy godmother because she showered us with such fascinating letters and unusual gifts. Her packages seemed almost magical to us, and we looked forward to what she would send for Christmas and birthdays. It was always something we had never seen before and quite extravagant. She started a collection of beautiful foreign dolls for Anne, and when I graduated from high school, she sent me a bed jacket covered in pink ostrich feathers that looked like something worn by a movie star. There were large baskets of dried nuts and fruits for the whole family, along with beautiful books on the wonders of Southern California. Our father managed Cousin Belle's Cleburne property, and this gave us various advantages as well. The house we grew up in was on Bellevue Drive, named for Cousin Belle, of course, and we kept our horses on her land at the end of the street. That pasture gave us a great place to play when we were growing up. Also, when the circuses came to town, they rented vacant lots on this land, meaning we got passes to the circus grounds as well as to the shows. When Tom Mix's Wild West show played there, Tom's favorite horse, Tony, was staked in the pasture with our horses. That and following Tom Mix around the showgrounds was unforgettable thrills for me when I was 9 years old. A regular visitor in grandmother's home was Aunt Nan, her father's sister, who had outlived 2 husbands. She showed her regard for Hattie by giving her a large reference Bible published in 1869 that was arranged according to subjects and also had a concordance and other study helps. This rare Bible was borrowed by several minister friends of the family for research and study. It was eventually passed down to my father and then to me, and is a family treasure. I have a picture of great-great Aunt Nan holding me as a baby in 1924 while she was sitting on the running board of my father's Model T Ford, or an early Chevrolet, looking as spry as could be. She died the next year at an amazing age of 90. Her great-grandson, Stephen Clements, has done extensive genealogical research and provided me with several helpful materials for this family history. He also put me in touch with others who have given more information. Nan's sister-in-law, Naomi, the widow of John Kilo, lived even longer as she celebrated her 93rd birthday in 1941. Naomi's birthday wish was to ride in an airplane, and so her son gave this spirited lady who had come to Texas in an ox-drawn wagon the thrill of her life with an airplane flight from Fort Worth to Dallas. After that, she said she had done everything she wanted to do, and she died the next year. The Kilo women in my family background were very strong physically as well as mentally and spiritually, and the Kilo men married strong women. I am so proud and thankful for this heritage. As Ed and Hattie aged and their health did eventually begin to decline, he with leukemia and she with osteoporosis, Kate took over the housework as well as their care. When their eyesight dimmed, she read most of the Cleveland newspaper aloud to them every day, as well as parts of the Bible. Also, grandmother's classics were read to her, with Milton being her favorite. My father visited more often and did what he could to help as well. He talked to them every day on the phone, and when I got old enough, I was often given that responsibility. In 1936, when Texas celebrated its centennial, 100 years after it became independent from Mexico, grandmother wanted to visit old Fort Parker that had been restored for the centennial. The all-day trip was difficult with her condition, but she was so eager to see this place and to honor the relatives killed there that my father took her. I got to go too, and it was very interesting to see what the fort had been like. Most of all, we enjoyed seeing what the visit meant to grandmother. After Ed died in 1939, Hattie's osteoporosis gradually worsened, and it became harder for her to get around. Her devout faith never wavered, and she never lost her sweet spirit. one would not know she was ever in pain, but she objected strongly when the doctor told her to drink a toddy every night. She said she had never drunk liquor and was not going to start now. In 1941, when she was 79 years old, grandmother fell, breaking her hip and injuring her back, and never did recover. She was confined to the bed for 4 months before her death, and the last book she asked Kate to read to her was Milton's Paradise Lost. Ministers from the Anglin Street Presbyterian Church, as well as the First Christian Church, were frequent visitors, and they would conduct her funeral service together. The Presbyterian minister said that she seemed to him like a beautiful flower in full bloom. I was a freshman at Trinity University, the school her cousins had helped to create, when called home for grandmother's last days. Like with Granddad's passing, the whole family gathered around the bed to say goodbye when the doctor said she could not last the night. As she took her last breaths, she had the most peaceful look I have ever seen, even joyful. There could be no doubt that grandmother was sure she was going to meet her Lord and to be with her husband again. Among those coming to grandmother's home to express their condolences were 2 granddaughters of Jim Mayfield, her father's former slave. It was still customary in Cleburne at that time for blacks to go to the back door of a white person's home and to sit in the kitchen. However, these women, who were school teachers, confidently came to the front door, knowing they would be welcome there and invited to sit in the living room with other friends and relatives as they were. Our family felt honored by this visit, and we were touched by its significance. It was a link to the Kilo past, to Sam and Mary and their plantation life in Tennessee, to Isaac and his Mary and the family they brought to Texas, and to Alex and Lizzie and the joys and sorrows of their lives, as well as to the slave who was so much a part of it. It seemed to be such a fitting tribute to grandmother and her family background, as well as to the grandfather of these women and the life he made for his family after his freedom from slavery